Hi everyone, my name's Mrs. Kim Wild and I'm the Assistant REC at St John Bosco College, Engadine. And today I will be focusing on the significant person part of the syllabus in Buddhism for the 14th Dalai Lama. I've been teaching and marking Buddhism for about 15 years. I'm really passionate about it and I love teaching it. But I think the focus of my webinar today, particularly over the years that I've been teaching and marking it, will be around looking at exam technique. I really find that marking Buddhism and teaching Buddhism often students found it really difficult to bring the Buddhist content, which is really rich in itself and it can stand up on its own. But there's just seemed to be a need to be able to bring that content, particularly scripturally, in line and with some parity with some of the other traditions like Christianity and Judaism and Islam. So the focus of today will be a little bit more obviously looking at the key content that students can use, but more so this webinar or this masterclass will focus on some strategies that have been really successful in helping my students do that. It'll be a bit of a focus on alignment of content, depth of examples, and moving from description to explanation and analysis, just in line with verb requirements and things like that. Hopefully those successes that we've had in being able to sort of, I don't know, bring up our content a little bit in this section, you'll find, some insights and some things that work for you. So what I want to start with, first of all, is just going in to look at just some key elements that I focus on when I begin, a topic on the Dalai Lama. So obviously when you start, when I start teaching this content with my students, I focus on some key things. When looking at a significant person, students obviously have to talk about the impact of that person, as part of that tradition. And I think there is no better way to think about this in relation to the Dalai Lama than thinking about the fact that he's definitely a man of the present. The immanence of this faith is that, the present moment is something that is really important. And the idea that there is no bigger impact than someone that is still alive, that's actually in the here and the now. I say to my students that, a lot of the stuff you'll speak about with the Dalai Lama is really of significance in that sense. The other thing you can see on this slide here also is this idea of how the Dalai Lama, another name for the Dalai Lama is the ocean of wisdom. And for contemporary Buddhists, the Dalai Lama in himself really, I suppose, is that ocean of wisdom for all Buddhists, not just the tradition that he is the head of. Students have the opportunity, and I say to my students, have the opportunity to look at current updates. There's links to current issues, aspects of faith, things that the Dalai Lama, is commenting on in the here and now. And so that's a really another significant, I suppose, advantage that students have when they're choosing this section, and that they should focus on it. And the final term that I like to introduce overall is just this idea of the Bodhisattva. For those that may not be aware, the Dalai Lama is obviously the head of the Mahayana variant, the head of the Tibetan Buddhist variant, the Vajrayanan variant, but is also very well regarded in Mahayana Buddhism. And the word Bodhisattva actually comes from the Mahayana variant. Bodhi meaning enlightened and Sattva meaning existence. And in Mahayana Buddhism, according to that, a Bodhisattva is a person who is able to reach nirvana, but actually delays doing so through compassion for suffering beings. The Dalai Lama himself, in being a Bodhisattva and being understood as a Bodhisattva, is actually a being that has reached enlightenment, but is still on earth to assist others in their journey. And I say to my students, there is no more there is no more bigger impact than that. The fact that this person in his significance is still here on earth, and that is his sole purpose, to assist others in reaching enlightenment. And that is a key takeaway that I think that, I always begin my understanding of the Dalai Lama with. So the next slide is basically just sort of looks at another piece of information that I give my students when we start looking at the significant person part of the syllabus. And I think it is really helpful for my students in understanding that there is a difference in some ways between a contribution and an impact. I found this, or they found this, really helpful in looking at when we're trying to discern between different verbs and content depth. So I find also that this can be helpful, understanding the differences between the two, when we look at paths through the paper as well. We sort of try and help direct our students, particularly when we're looking at different traditions, to look at their path through the paper. A lot of my students will choose Buddhism as an extended response. And so therefore, looking at this idea of impact and understanding the difference between a contribution and an impact is also going to help them be able to write on a deeper level. So when I teach my kids about this contribution and impact syllabus-wise, we talk about a contribution as being something that the significant person, brings to the religion itself in order to enhance it. But the big takeaway from that is the idea that it influences the religion within the religion. Now, because the Dalai Lama obviously is a man of the present and is still alive, there are still things that he's doing to influence the religion as a whole within the religion. Sometimes on the board, I'll draw a little diagram and I'll have arrows coming inwards towards the religion to help them understand that that's something he does to contribute. As opposed to that, when we're looking at the idea of impact, often when I draw this as well, the arrows are then pointing outwards. And it's just this idea that, the impact of a significant person influences the lives of the people adhering to that religion, but it also goes outward from that religion, to the wider community of adherents. And that sort of turns a little bit more into the legacy that this person might have. And it sort of helps my students in some ways in understanding that a lot of the time, if you're answering questions in section 2, most of those things, depending on the verb, could probably fit under contributions. And later on, when I start to give some examples about how to break up content and how to streamline content, this will become a little bit more apparent. Some of my students that are just answering significant person questions or Buddhism in section 2 will tend to just focus on the contribution of the Dalai Lama, whereas when you're starting to write with more depth and higher order verbs, being able to lead with this idea of impact and judgment really helps with them, remembering their content and being able to apply that correctly in the exam. So there's just a couple of things that, we've done and a couple of concepts that we've done before we actually get into our content. So if we move on just a little bit, one other thing that I found was really helpful when looking at content on the Dalai Lama also was to help my students in the syllabus sort of break up between the idea of the contribution or the impact on the development of the tradition, as well as the expression of the tradition. And my students found it really helpful sometimes to be able to break that up. I know when we start talking about the Dalai Lama, there's going to be a lot of those contributions and impacts, that are going to overlap in terms of expression and development. But for some students, they also found it really helpful just to break down what that actually meant. So when I teach this part on the contribution to the development of Buddhism, I ask my students to consider what the Dalai Lama actually did. I sort of say, what did he do, right? That changed the structure or the path of the faith. So there's a couple of points that we sort of would put under that. We look at the fact that, the fact that he preserved and expanded Buddhism in the face of the Tibetan invasion, the fact that he was able to, through interfaith dialogue, through outreach to other religions, these sorts of things actually changed the structure and the path of the religion. Had the Tibetan invasion not have happened, had he not been so universal in reaching out to different aspects in other religions, that the religion would look very different to what it does now. So in some ways, it helped my students to understand that there are significant things that are done, significant impacts, significant contributions that the Dalai Lama made to the development of Buddhism or the structure of the faith or the path of the faith. And then obviously there are significant things that the Dalai Lama did in relation to looking at how the faith is practiced. So when we think of expression of Buddhism, we talk about how the faith, how he influences the way the faith is practiced. And I suppose there are many examples, and in the next couple of slides, we'll look at that, of how he's actually transformed how people understand Buddhist teaching, how people express Buddhist teaching, especially in relation to bringing that into the Western world through technology and so forth, and just in the sense of the universal practice that he has really made Buddhism to be. We spoke about the fact that he is just, the head of one Buddhist variant. However, at the end of the day, his impact really does extend across all three because of the significant things that he's done. So obviously also these sorts of things in structuring different essays and different types of responses also help my students order their content too, and I'll talk to that with a little bit more depth a little bit later. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about really was just some information that looked at biographical content. One of, I think, the biggest misconceptions, particularly in Buddhism, because there is so much content that you could speak about with the Dalai Lama, so much general content, so many, because he's very well known in the world. You know, a lot of the time when we're talking about significant people, some students will focus a little bit too much on biographical information, and they get caught up in telling the story of the significant person. I'm not saying that this is not an important part. I mean, obviously, in this case, the contextual underpinnings of the Tibetan invasion are really crucial to understanding, you know, the importance of the Dalai Lama and what he actually did with the faith. You know, it's essential in understanding the full depth and breadth of his impact. But as I say to my students, I would argue that perhaps just what is on this screen here really is all you'd need. Particularly, I say to them, you know, a first line in section 2, even in an 8 marker, or briefly setting up context in an essay, no more than, you know, half a paragraph in terms of just underpinning who this person was and being able to, I suppose, show your marker that you understand that it was this context that led to some of the contributions that he had. You know, and you've got a couple of key things there. Basically, you know, if students can ascertain and understand that he's a spiritual leader of the Tibetan school of Buddhism, you know, they're showing variantal knowledge, but also just this idea that, you know, the Tibetan invasion happened, as I said, really crucial underpinning contextually, but there's a great little sentence there that just allows them to show that knowledge and then move straight into the content that's really important. So we get on to having a look now just at some suggestions on content. I think what's worked for us mostly in this context is being able to really you know, logically order our content and attempt to bring it on par with some of the other traditions. So when I've got up the top here, content suggestions, and I say simplify, what I don't mean is simplify, you know, the content that you're using, right? We don't want it to be too general. We want to be able to simplify the process that we use in order to make sure that we have all of those key elements that are needed in a response. So this is an example of something that we set up, or that I set up, a little table. And I found tabulating information for the Dalai Lama was really useful. So in terms of this table, this is something that my students have put together along with, you know, some of my direction. And it's used predominantly for us in terms of section 2. So what you can see, and this is what I was really sort of trying to focus on here, is that we've got obviously a set of contributions, right? And some key lines, some key wording to be able to sort of make up our topic sentence in a shorter, lower verb response, a section 2 response. What I did say to my students was also, though, we don't want to get caught up in the general, right, contributions of the Dalai Lama, you know, something that he did. Well, he preserved Tibetan Buddhism. But I said to them, what we need to be able to do is also, you know, particularly if we're moving up the criteria in a section 2 response, you know, bring in those details that support that example. Right. And in many cases, you know, most students in a section 2 response at a C level will be able to identify a contribution. And then if they support that with some examples, that's really important. The other takeaway here that I think is really important that we spent a lot of time on was trying to align our contributions, our examples, okay, with scripture. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, I find, particularly with significant person, sometimes it's not as easy to align the scriptural underpinnings with some of the contributions and impacts that the Dalai Lama had, simply because obviously they're talking a lot contemporary wise, because he is refining that you know, that expression daily in terms of what he's producing universally on platforms like Twitter and his website. However, in many cases, for any tradition, the main underpinnings come from scripture. And so we went about trying to really find some alignment in our content in terms of what the Dalai Lama actually did, being able to give some depth in examples to support that, and then building on that with something that's contemporary, but also something that was founded in scripture. So you sort of, in some ways, got a bit of a paragraph structure across, the row of this table to help students actually build that example. And that could be sort of scaled forward and back depending on what the verb was. And you can see that there's a couple of examples of that there. And if I just pop over to the next slide, you can sort of see, and I'm not going to go through every single slide here, but you can sort of see that there is a way of doing that with lots of different types of contributions. Now, if I go back to the idea that I brought forward right at the beginning about the contribution being something that the Dalai Lama did in relation to the faith, within the faith, most of these, okay, yes, can be extended to look at impacts, but at the end of the day, these are things that he's physically done with detailed examples to bring them into that top band and contemporary examples, but also linked to scripture in that sense. So really these first content suggestions are really around looking at section 2. And I mean, obviously you can see with some of those examples, the other big takeaway is just the tracing of the example through each of these parts of the row. So in other words, the contribution in itself in promoting Buddhism to the West is then further expanded through the depth of these examples. You wouldn't have to use all of them. You would then link on and create a little bit more depth and detail in terms of the contemporary quote, but then also found it in scripture and where that comes from as well. Okay. So section 2, I found, particularly for my students that were looking at the Dalai Lama in section 2, they were able to really consolidate their content, into 4 key areas, really, if you look at those last 2 slides, and it really helped them to be able to apply their content to the verb, but also just have this logical correlation, through examples. Okay. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more when we get into essay content as well. So if I step over to the next slide, okay, this content is more, for essay depth. Okay, so you can start to see the difference between looking just at contributions, where often we may be asked in a 3 marker, 5 marker, up to a 7 or 8 marker. And some of those examples in the slides before, could be brought up and down in terms of that verb difficulty or verb length. So when we get into essay depth, which is where we sort of align our students talking about the Dalai Lama in essays. Through my marking experience over the years, what I've found is that students, particularly with the Dalai Lama, because there's so much general universal content that's available, students sort of got stuck speaking in generalities around the Dalai Lama. And to be able to really, tap into and bring Buddhism in line and on par with those other traditions, students needed to be able to show depth in relation to the verb and move some of that description, even small explanation, into analysis. And I found that sort of easier, and maybe this comes from my English background. I'm also an English teacher, sort of to be able to, again, tabulate information, but also to lead from an impact statement sort of idea in that sense. So if we can see what's on the screen now, it's a table. And I'm sort of going to focus on the fact that when we teach this to our students, we almost have in the first column just this idea that, we're trying to get the students to draw out a bit of a critical judgment, particularly, if they get a higher order verb. And oftentimes, particularly in TUNIT, I find it easier to sort of teach the higher verb, and then it's easier for them to sort of stem back down from that way. So if we start with analysis or we start with evaluation, if the students know how to evaluate, then they're already doing more than what they need to if the verb goes down into a middle verb or a how or explain, etc. So what we've found success in is sort of setting up examples to show them a couple of different things. So we start a little bit with what we call, or what I've named, an impact statement. So it's sort of like I'm getting the kids to create a bit of a thesis, because, it's important in studies of religion, particularly when you get up into the analysis verbs, not so much as it is in English to sustain a thesis all the way through, but when we look at some of our marking criteria in section 3, a lot of those marking criteria, particularly up in that A range or that band 6 range, you know, kids are able to sustain a reasoned judgment in relation to these people. You know, the last year's HSC was a typical example of that. So students need to have the language, they need to have the preparation and some of the tools to be able to do that. And so this is how we teach, or how I teach, trying to show them how to do that. Obviously, they're going to get a lot of marks for their content, because SOR is all about showing, you know, their depth of content, their accuracy of content. But sometimes I talk to them about the fact that top band and then pushing into that 17 out of 20 really, in many cases, is not so much about how much content you have. It's more about how you're dealing with the verb and how everything comes together. So if we have a look quickly at this, the big takeaway from this, I think, is the color coding. So we look at sort of, you know, including what we call an impact statement ensures the tradition is kept dynamic in the contemporary world through the simplification and clarification of Buddhist teachings. So obviously his impact is massive in terms of the expression of the faith, and he does that through simplifying and clarifying and utilizing, you know, many different mediums in order to do that. So we start with what the impact is, and I say to my students that can often be a topic sentence in that sense, and it sets out what they're going to speak about with the Dalai Lama. The big takeaway, though, that I want to talk about here is just the idea that that topic sentence or that idea or that impact is actually carried through and linked to examples. So when we talk about simplification and clarification of Buddhist teachings, right, you can see in this contribution column that they then further expand on that. How does he simplify? Well, he translates the Dharma for contemporary worship. You know, how does he do that specifically? Well, perhaps what he might do is embrace that through modern technology. So you can start to see how we've got an impact, and then we're sort of saying, well, what does he do in the here and now through his contribution to actually trace that example through? So we build on it and we give some more specifics. I then say to them, we need to give more specifics again to unpack that. So we not only translating for contemporary worship and utilizing social media forms such as Twitter, we then give a specific example in relation to that. And you can see through the color coding here that what I've sort of tried to show is we start with the impact statement, simplification. We give a contribution. What is he doing? Well, he's translating. How does he translate that? Well, he does that through his translation of the Bardo Thodol. And you can start to see here how we are building upon the examples and giving more depth. How does he embrace modern technology and social media forms such as Twitter? Well, we give a specific example with a specific date, and we also maybe even add a quote. Now, obviously, you can see that there are multiple examples here. And depending on the question and depending on how students answer the question, these things, I suppose, are going to vary. They may not use every single example that they have in the third column there, but they've got enough to be able to support the impact statement that they've made around simplification and clarification, and then be able to, depending on the nature of the question, whether it's holistic, whether it's just a single stream question like this year, to be able to bring in the content that works, okay, but that also draws, traces through and sustains their argument or their content in terms of what they're saying around impact. And I think you can sort of see that really clearly when you look in that tabulated form. The other thing that I think essay-wise that I say to my students, again, and I've got it in the section 2, but also to bring it on par in parity with some of the other traditions, is just the scriptural basis, being able to underpin that scripturally. You know, just has so much weight. Marking Buddhism for so many years, one of the biggest things that I notice is that students have really, really good content knowledge. Sometimes it's a little bit generalized, but it's not underpinned in scripture like the other traditions are, and that really does pay. So we worked hard to be able to try and align that in terms of showing them how to sustain an example, build on an example, and then, you know, draw some conclusions around analysis. And I'll show a few examples of how we do that as well. So if we move just onto the next slide, and again, I'm not going to talk all the way through these, but these are just suggestions. So you can see that there's a number of examples. Students have come up with, you know, impact statements, and then they're tracing their examples through contribution to giving depth of example and then underpinning that with scripture. Okay. and obviously use that at your own discretion if it works for you. And that's pretty much, some of the things that we've found that have worked for them, and I've talked about the use of color contribution, something that he did, and then it's linked to a depth of example, the details in that high range of the criteria. Okay. I think this is really effective because if students can understand that if they work through an example like this and can see it built and they can see conclusions drawn, then they know that it's going to be sustained. And this is sort of developing their understanding of what a sustained response is. Often when we're teaching like this, I sort of will bring up a criteria, an essay criteria, particularly with those higher order verbs, and look at what the idea of a sustained reason response means. And I think in some ways this breaks it down to sort of partly show students how to do it. And it sort of partly worked for us. So there's a number of examples there that you could have a look at. You will notice that in some cases, there is overlap in terms of Dalai Lama content. And we've tried to break it up in terms of different things that he has done, and that's why the tabulated form works really well. So we're sort of trying to break up those examples to ensure that there's almost an impact statement for each example. But yeah, it really has worked, I suppose, particularly for our 2-unit students, to be able to see how that's developed and order their notes so they can, remember the content in this way for the depth, but then also, apply that in the exam, accordingly, depending on the verb, etc. And it really has helped, I think, with their understanding of how to analyse. Again, particularly in the marking centre this year, what I was noticing was a lot of students' inability to be able to draw that conclusion at the end. They were really good with the cause and effect. They were able to sort of even make a judgment, talk about an impact of the Dalai Lama, give some really good detailed examples. But I mean, that conclusion at the end was a little bit lacking, just in terms of being able to draw all that back together. And that's the analysis, and it's really a key skill. Final parting thing that I will say, simply because I'm still on, this tabulated form, sometimes I would say to my students that depending on the verb, obviously with something like evaluate or analyze, it's great to sort of lead in with that judgment, with that impact statement that has the judgment in it. But in some cases, what my students have done in the past as well is worked from a contribution level and a depth of example level, but also has sort of used that impact statement really to sort of come in at the end, which really does, I suppose, draw that analysis back into or draw that conclusion. So there's nothing to say that you couldn't use a statement like, through the promotion of human values, religious harmony and understanding, the Dalai Lama has deepened expression, or as a result of. So it really does draw that conclusion. So really the kids could actually work backwards through this table if they really wanted to as well, or starting with their contribution example scripture and then sort of link back to draw the conclusion around the impact. So it could be done in any different way. It just ensures that they're really hitting and targeting those verbs. So I hope that, that different ways of setting out that content has been a little bit helpful for you. We've found it vastly helpful in breaking it down and just making it a little bit more aligned, systematic, easy to understand, but also really sort of trying to lift the way that our students are writing and bring Buddhism, on par with some of those other traditions, and the depth of those other traditions and the specificity of those other traditions. So the only other thing that I wanted to share, obviously, sorry, before I do that, please encourage your students, if you're teaching the Dalai Lama, as I started with before, the importance of contemporary examples. These are only just a couple of places, I suppose, that students could have really current things that are going on that show the immense significance of this person, simply because he's still doing it. He's still alive. And I don't think that it can be more impactful than that. I often will have my kids bookmark the Dalai Lama's website, which you can see there. Oftentimes they will follow his Twitter. He's also on Instagram, and he does have a Facebook page. But even if they just Google contemporary articles around what he's doing in the here and now, his response, to things in the world through peace and conflict, ethical issues, etc., having contemporary examples is really important. A lot of my students that attempt Buddhism in the extended response through that path through the paper, particularly unit students, will also have that heightened impact and evaluation, because they also use him as an example in religion and peace, if they're doing Buddhism in religion and peace. So that's really critical. If you're teaching it or if you're studying it, get onto these websites, pull out your contemporary examples. They're the ones that are going to set you apart. So the final thing that I wanted to discuss today, again, is just about, in some ways, how easy it is, or how easy it can be to move yourself up a band. I found teaching exam literacy, particularly to the students at my school, was something that was really important. And this went from 1 unit SOR all the way up to 2 unit SOR. And when we gave the students an opportunity to understand the exam literacy, and in some ways how it was fairly easy to move up one band, I think they found, in some ways, a way to improve their work that was really sort of making a difference when they got into the exam. Because we haven't had a syllabus change for a number of years, I always speak to my students about the importance of being exam fit. SOR really is all about the exam, and it's all about application. The entire underpinnings of the course, really are cemented in the real world, and I'm really of that opinion in terms of, real world application. And I spoke about that with the Dalai Lama and how significant he is, in the sense that his real world application is still happening. However, I think in many cases, what we tried to develop at our place was some literacy workshop that helped students to understand what was required for in the exam, because I think some of them, in many cases, saw it as being very onerous to try and improve their results. And so we tried to break that down to just, the premise of moving up just one band. So first, what we wanted to reinforce with all of our kids is just that what all responses require in an SOR setting. So, and again, this is stuff that I've developed that's worked in my context. It's by no means the authority of what is there. It just comes from my experience around teaching studies of religion, and perhaps what is required in looking at an SOR response to get a top band response. So hopefully this is, helpful for you. So we talked about the idea, or we give the kids the understanding, that all SOR questions, require an understanding of the verb. There's obviously content that you need in order to, move up the bands in your criteria. Scripture is essential in those underpinnings, and sometimes Buddhism, that's lacking because the scripture isn't, as always, as easy to find, and we're not as familiar with it. And also this idea of being able to link to the question and utilize our terminology. Okay, so this is generally what we show them. So in understanding that, what I think students need to understand is the fact that there is a difference between a low range response, a mid-range response, and a high range response. Okay, and so we generally take our students through these descriptors, and we try to give them an understanding of what's required at different levels, but also we get them to identify where their response sits. And so traditionally we've done these sorts of workshop post trials, but we've also tried to bring that into alignment a little more and do it a little bit earlier, sort of post assessment or post a topic test, just to show them that it's really, if we are targeting the type of revision we're doing to our own personal needs and where our responses are, it's not really all that difficult to sort of move up the band, to go from very general information into information that builds on that to show an understanding of content, into clear understanding of content and verbs and relevant, detailed, accurate. So we get them to look at their responses and sort of pick where they think they might fall. Are they a low range response? Are they a mid-range response? Are they a high range response? In some ways, I tend to keep away from mark value in this sense. I just get them to try and identify the type of response that they use. And so if I show you how this sort of plays out, when we start to look at a section 2 question, if I just pop those here, many of you will be familiar with this type of question. It's got a stimulus, it's an 8 marker, middle order verb with the how, but students are going to need to be able to make, connections between this, and it's difficult in some ways for them to be able to access this question, particularly if they're functioning in a low range response at the moment. So I sort of would then say to the students, and when I say low range response, what I'm about to present to you, I suppose sort of starts more from a lower mid-range response. What we do with our students, and most of our students will sit there, most of our students will start as a C range student, a student that will be using generalized information, that will have some depth of knowledge, some terminology, a little bit of depth, but it's a little bit too general and they need to build on that. Okay, so most of this sort of stuff sort of shows them how they can build on that material. So the question that we're going to have a look at just through some examples is this 2017 HSC question in section 2. So if I just move on, this is a task that we ask our students to do. So first of all, they're asked to think about where their response lies, but then we give them an exemplar response and we get them to understand, and we try to show them in many cases how you can build up information. And I think it works really well visually in what I'm about to show you with the students particularly, because when you are able to see the distinction between what makes up a C range response, what makes up a B range response, and then how you actually push into that A range, it really sort of starts to open their eyes, and they realize in some ways, oh, it's actually not that difficult to do that. I already do this, and then I'm going to build up to this, and I'm going to build up to this. So, for example, if I click to the next slide, we give them a sample response. And in some ways, what we ask them to do first is I say to them, identify the information that you would consider to be, C range information. So if I went back to the table we had before, I'd say to the kids, the blue information you're going to highlight is going to be generalized. It's going to be more reference to the main aspects. It's going to lack a bit of detail. Some terminology may be there, but there's not really a judgment that's made there. Okay, so when I look at a response like this, this is a response to the 8 marker. Most C range kids are going to be able to tell you the name of your significant person. They may also, have that buzzword or that term bodhisattva, and understand that the bodhisattva links to Mahayana variant. You can see here that hopefully at C range, kids are going to understand that he's the figurehead of Buddhism. They'll probably also be able to write that he's non-violent in his approach to all he does. And maybe some of those terms that we can use, like Bardo Thodol, which is, the Vajrayana Buddhist texts, and things like metta and karuna. A C range kid will be able in some ways to be able to identify that, but perhaps not be able to expand. And so then what we do with our students is we say, if we look at our next slide, if we build on that, the green then is moving it up to a B range. So you can partly see here how they've moved beyond just identifying who the person is to add a few little parts of detail. You can see, they've added in the stimulus there with the truth. Added in a little bit more in terms of giving a bit more depth in relation to what the purpose of life is. Because if you recall what the question was, it was around working towards enlightenment and how the Dalai Lama assists Buddhists in doing that. But you can partly see just visually how they build on that information and just give a little bit more. If I then flick to the A, what you can see predominantly is that there is a lot more information that fills in the gaps here. Visually, students can see that it's really the connectives that are starting to bring them up into that A range level. If we look at some of the stuff that we can see in the A, it's starting to bring in that judgment, the most significant, the consistent, the essentially, but it's more than that. Okay, most kids, even in a B range, can make a judgment. Note the level of language when you read through this. It's the connection, it's the details, it's the linking the details to each other. The line that sticks out to me is this idea of, through the universality of his image appearing as the figurehead of Buddhism, he significantly encourages adherents to work towards the truth. So it's those connectives, it's drawing those conclusions that actually hit analysis even. that's needed. So I think the biggest takeaway in looking at this visually for students, and we actually get them to do this highlighting themselves, like we actually give it to them on a sheet of paper and they're highlighting different things. But the biggest takeaway is just that, the color coding. When they are able to see that by adding this next step, by adding this next step, by adding this next step, I can actually sort of build my response from a C, okay, all the way up to the A with those extra details. And I often say to them, particularly in this one, what color do you see as dominant? And they say to me, oh, well, yellow. And I say, well, there you go, in terms of the content is important, but what puts you into an A is essentially how all that fits together. So finally, that was sort of an example of how we do it in section 2. Section 3, there's an example here as well, because it is a little bit different in terms of how they would attack an essay in that sense. Obviously, essay has a deeper verb mostly, can have variations in the way that whether it's a holistic essay, whether it's a single streamed essay on a single aspect. So oftentimes, particularly with our kids that are doing that pathway through the paper, we talk a lot about just being able, I suppose, to hit that content and then also be able to build on that to move again from your C to your A, to your B to your A, and adding those details. So if I just show you, obviously this is the question that we use. This isn't a past HSC question. It's one that we've used in our topic test, but mirrors a holistic HSC question. No one saves us but ourselves. No one can and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. To what extent? So we've gone with a higher order verb. We want a judgment, and how Buddhism assists adherents in walking the path. Because this is a masterclass specifically on the Dalai Lama, what my examples show here in how to build that is very much around just a response partly on the Dalai Lama. But obviously, if students were answering this in the HSC, they would, link into all aspects in this case. So introduction-wise, again, just to talk through this, you can see at a C range level, if a student is sort of, in that range around 11, 12, etc., essentially they're going to be able to hopefully write in the right tradition, name their significant person, and basically be able to identify their aspects. And you can see in the C that's being highlighted there that they've done that. They probably also know that he does model for adherence the correct way of life, because essentially one of the great impacts is his embodiment of Buddhist virtues and so forth. And then they're going to ultimately, I suppose, attempt to link that back to the question. When I talk students through moving up in terms of introduction on that, it's just a simple set of sentences, right? So by adding that Buddhism is immanent, by linking that to the stimulus, by bringing in even a variant in the introduction, and I'm not saying go into depth, but I mean the fact that they speak about the Mahayana path, because the stimulus in this case is about, walking the path alone, whereas Vajrayanan Buddhists and Mahayanan Buddhists are very much about help on that journey. The Dalai Lama himself, that's his sole purpose as a bodhisattva, is to help on that journey. So students are actually showing more knowledge by bringing in, even at that B level, the extra parts of that information. They're adding little bits in terms of the ways that he's doing that. He's not only embodying Buddhist virtues, but he's actually trying to do that by living a life of ahimsa, or living a life of equanimity. The other thing that I wanted to be clear about as well is just even, as I said, it's been a real passion of mine trying to bring Buddhism up into parity, particularly scripturally, against Christianity and Islam and Judaism. And it's taken us a long time to be able to do this, but there's been a lot of depth in terms of kids actually referencing key things that they're speaking about. So not just scripture quotes, but also key concepts, key teachings, things that they're learning. Equanimity is a teaching that comes out of the Buddhist understanding of peace. But these references have been well researched, and I think in some ways sort of brings their response up in terms of that specificity. And in many cases, prior to a lot of this in Buddhism, some of that was often missing. It's not easy to find. I can't say without a shadow of a doubt that I'm the authority on this sort of stuff. I've done a lot of reading, particularly scholarly reading, to be able to sort of find these types of things. But at the end of the day, I think it really has helped our students to be able to see that the rich content in terms of Buddhism is still underpinned, like any religious tradition, in scripture. And I think being able to show that shows a lot. And just so obviously in your introduction, if we show the next one, we then start to see where we bring up that language into the A. When we're bringing in the judgment, we're starting to draw some conclusions around some of those contributions, that are in blue, and clear interaction with the question in the A. And so finally, and I won't talk you through every single part of this, but if I sort of move on, there's also an example of how that's done in a paragraph too. So obviously an introduction in an essay is really important. I always say to my students that hooks the reader. Most of the time as a marker, if I've read the introduction, a lot of the times introduction and first paragraph, I know where that kid's sitting straight away because they know their stuff. And it's the way that it comes across. So if we just look really briefly at these paragraphs, it's much the same idea, like with the examples of content set out earlier in the presentation. It visually shows them how to build on and sustain an idea. They start with that contribution and they give some information. If I just flick through, they then add some of the depth and detail to move themselves up to a B. And then obviously, visually showing them how to sustain that idea through the connectives of that A range, and I think it's quite powerful in how to sustain that idea. For our students, even visually, it's been really powerful in, the tabulated form to see how an example is built, but also when you look at it color-coded here, I think they sort of understand that, of course, they're going to have to know their content, but that it's not really all that difficult to add a couple more details or a little bit more depth or that judgment or that conclusion, which will actually bring them up a band. So that's been really powerful for our students to see that in those sorts of workshops. And then there's just another example there of a paragraph too. Okay. So I hope in some ways, some of what I've presented today has been helpful, just in terms of being able to have a way of approaching this content with your students, a way of being able to break down the content that in some ways is not ridiculously complex, but to be able to use it in a way that is going to be effective in an exam situation. So I hope some of what I've shared has worked. It's worked for us, I know that, and I hope you get some benefits or some insights into your own teaching practice. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all the best wishes for the 2025 HSC and beyond, and in true Buddhism style. Namaste. Thank you.